Hello, parents. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our Speak Up Facebook Live. This is one of a series of Facebook Live series or events that Speak Up organizes to keep parents informed about issues affecting their children's education. Please click like on this Facebook page to stay informed about future events like this. My name is Lisa Moscow. I'm the Director of Educational Rights Advocacy at Speak Up, and today I will be your moderator. By now, most schools have reopened after more than a year of distance education. It has been a difficult year for many. We've had families that struggle to connect online, and even for those who were able to connect easily, students were challenged to stay engaged and learn effectively with Zoom. But more than anything, it was a dramatic change for children in special education. For some, staying home was supported by one-on-one support from their parents, and they actually found more success. For others, children suffered because their families or their parents were not able to give them the type of support that they had grown accustomed to and were provided through their IEPs at schools. And they regressed a great deal. For most, school openings or school closings have deepened and accelerated existing inequities in education. And I think this rings especially true for students with disabilities. So we've assembled a panel of parent leaders with us today who will share with us their experiences over the past year. We've also invited an amazing special education attorney, Alexis Casillas, who is also the legal director of Learning Rights Law Center. And she will give us advice on how to best advocate for our children and work with schools to provide them the maximum support. Thank you everyone for joining me today. So with us today are our parent leaders. We have Tammy, we have Noelle, and we have Carla, all amazing advocates for their children and for other kids in their own rights. And I wanted you to each introduce yourself and tell us the ages of your children and what grade they're in. I'll start with Tammy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tammy. I have 4 children that I'm an advocate for. I have one who's on the spectrum. He's autistic. I have 2 who have an issue with comprehending, and I have another who is physical. It's his physical appearance. So it's challenging, and I know that I have to stay on top of things. So, and
I'm sure you have a very full plate.
Yes.
Thank you, Tammy. Yeah. Next, we'll go to Noelle.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Noelle. I currently have one kiddo, a son that is enrolled in school. He is in kindergarten. He actually is just turned 7 years old, so he should be in first grade, but we did hold him back because we had a hard time finding an appropriate placement for him for preschool. So we lost a lot of academic time in preschool, so we held him back. And we have 2 other children who have not yet entered the fun world yet, but my son is, like I said, 7 years old, and he is diagnosed with Down syndrome and also autism, and he's in a special day class setting.
Thank you, Noelle. And Carla.
Hi, my name's Carla. I have a 6.5-year-old son with moderate to severe autism. We live in the San Fernando Valley, and he's a kindergartner this year and an AUT core special day class in local district Northeast. Thank you.
Thank you, parents. And I'm already getting hellos on Facebook from Mary Alcantar and Andre Lopez. Hello to you guys. Thank you for watching. And I want to just let everyone know who's watching on Facebook that if you do have questions, I hope you can put them in the comment section and we'll try to get to them on the show. And if we don't, we will follow up afterwards. And now I'm going to hand it over to our special guest, Alexis Casillas. Alexis, thank you so much for joining us. I know you as a tremendous special education lawyer in the area and the legal director of Learning Rights Law Center. Thank you so much for your service. And I want to just start by asking you, what brought you to this space in the first place? What brought you to special education law?
Well, Lisa, thank you for having me. I was talking to the parents earlier, and I mentioned that I've been around special education and the IEP process for as long as I can remember, really. My younger brother has autism, big A, severe autism. So I remember watching kind of the process and seeing my family go through, get ready for the IEP meetings and talk about over the kitchen table different issues that were coming up. And around middle school, we actually had an instance where my family had to file for due process to try and get an appropriate placement for my brother. And I vividly remember being early teenager and looking at the system from the outside and thinking there has to be a better way, right? Like the request didn't seem onerous. Like it didn't make sense to me that parents with reasonable requests were having such a hard time getting what was appropriate for their kids. So I resolved in middle school to become like our family's attorney and head off to law school to be able to kind of continue the fight and make the system better for parents so that it all kind of worked a little better. So I've been doing this exclusively since I graduated, and that makes me a little unique in the field of special education law, but happy to do it and happy to be a support to really the people in the front, which is are the moms and dads and grandparents and foster parents and everybody else who is interacting with those IEP teams and having the hard conversations and advocating for students.
Thank you so much for your work. We're very lucky that you're there in the field and with us today. So I wanted to ask, it's been a year, over a year, and schools closed and they are reopening, but Alexis, what have you been seeing over the past year? Has LA Unified been able to follow through on its commitment to offering free and appropriate public education for all students during virtual learning, for students with disabilities during virtual learning?
So I always like to kind of contextualize this, right? Because as special education attorneys, it is the case that most of the time we don't really hear about the wins, right? Like people don't come to us if everything's going smoothly. That being said, I am the new legal director to the Learning Rights Law Center. I've just been here for a couple months. Before that, I was in private practice, but I have seen a couple of trends that have made me a little frustrated because, look, we're all in this crazy upside down world for as long as it's going to take us to kind of right things. And while we see light at the end of the tunnel, there was a long time when we didn't know how long we were going to be in there, which meant there was a big burden on parents and school districts to figure out how we were going to continue to meet our kids' needs with all of these additional stressors that were hard for us. So we know they were going to be hard for students, especially students with disabilities who can't process and don't understand and don't know why their routine has just been thrown out the window. And there was some forethought coming from policymakers, right? Like there was guidance coming from state and federal government agencies talking about how IEP teams were supposed to make these decisions for students with disabilities on an individualized basis. You were supposed to look at 10 kids on your IEP roll and make determinations for each and every one of them about what should or should not be modified to make Zoom learning or remote learning or whatever approach you were going to have to take for that student work for that student. And my read of guidance and the law is that meant you had to make individualized determinations based on needs, right? There were going to be some students, and we've seen this, for whom not being on a comprehensive campus is actually just great for them, right? Like maybe we don't want to send them back because when they don't have to deal with what's happening on a campus, they get their work done better. They have been able to approach relationships in a way that's more manageable to them. And for those students, like the kind of cookie cutter forms that I think a lot of you parents on the panel and certainly ones that contacted us got, where it was like the pronouncement, this is what's going to happen during COVID learning, that's not necessarily going to harm them or be like a denial of anything for those students who distance learning is working for them. But for the students whose programs fundamentally changed, there are a number of them who just, by virtue of their disability and their background, we're just not going to be able to benefit from the pronouncement that came home in the first place. And once that became clear, I think that LA Unified and all districts across the country needed to have a meeting with the parents and talk about like, okay, what's going to work, right? Like, has the schedule changed? Is the student no longer able to show up at the same like Zoom times? Do we need to think about like shifting so that like what the packet that's going home to the other 9 kids has to be tweaked? Like, these are all conversations that should have been having or should have been had, and they just weren't. That's not to say we're not sympathetic, right? Like, we know teachers and administrators were dealing with all sorts of craziness, but I didn't see, it felt to me like there was so much of just a scramble that it was easier to just stick with that initial pronouncement and not have the individual conversations and tweak the programs. And it was just kick the can. We're going to deal with this once we get down the road, and we'll fix it when we come back. So it'll be interesting to see if kind of that happens now that we're coming back to school and starting to talk about learning recruitment or compensatory education or whatever we're going to call it. How are we going to try and close the gaps that happened over the past year and a half?
That's an excellent point. You know, there so much has been thrown at us this past year, and it's like we never seem to catch up. I'd love to hear from our parents. Carla, would you like to share with us how the closure of schools this past year impacted your son, who just passed behind you, behind the frame?
Yeah. So yeah, you'll definitely hear him in the background. So yeah, this was our first year with LAUSD formally, and it's been really challenging. I think we were very fortunate in the sense that we have private insurance that not a lot of families have within the district. I think 80% are socioeconomically disadvantaged, so they may not have a PPO insurance policy. So when LAUSD was not offering the things that my son needed in person, and he couldn't do it virtually, so Zoom school wasn't working for him, virtual virtual speech, virtual OT. Do you want to say hi? Say hello, beautiful. So, you know, it wasn't working for him at all. And so we kind of had to, you know, form our own team, as it were. And my husband and I working from home, having our BTs come here through the pandemic the entire time. And then also having private speech and physical therapy at a clinic, specifically McCrory Pediatrics in Tarzana, which is here in the Valley. So we basically had to kind of supplement the supports and services he should have been receiving in school, and did it through private insurance. Now, like, as I mentioned before, a lot of families in LAUSD don't have that luxury. So those are the families that are in worse shape, I think, than our family. What we were able to obtain was some in-person services for him. So he can do basically OT and speech therapy on campus, as well as one-on-one tutoring with a special ed teacher. And a lot of kids weren't, I'm sorry, a lot of kids weren't getting tutoring from a special ed teacher. They were just getting it from a substitute. So I'm gonna put on mute because he's having a meltdown.
Thank you. So, Alexis, what, you know, have you seen this happen, what Carla's describing? With other parents, or is there, what done?
I definitely had it, and we're going to see kind of as we come out of this and start hearing stories about what happened on the ground, a couple different tiers about how families were able to kind of fill the gap and when they were not. Like Carla pointed out, there have been some families and who had either private insurance, or some of the regional centers actually stepped up and filled that gap. And for students who were not able to sit in front of a laptop unless they had a behavior sitting right next to them, like making sure they weren't slamming it down or throwing it across the room. Some families just had to figure out, how am I going to do that? Or it's going to have to be me, and that has whatever repercussions it has on the family, because not every student with a disability is an only child, and there are all sorts of trade-offs that happen.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question about that. What's really striking to me is that families were able to access behavioral therapists at home, in home, through health insurance, through the regional centers. But isn't that something that LAUSD should have been providing?
We definitely have seen it through other school districts. So it was not a question of it's impossible, it cannot be done. Public health guidelines did allow for in-person services. And I believe state and federal guidance actually allowed for LA Unified to provide in-person programming when it was necessary and appropriate. That's part of the lawsuit the Learning Rights Law Center filed with the Alliance for Children's Rights in the fall, trying to make the district evaluate when that was going to be appropriate, right? Like there's a spectrum, and there's learning loss across everybody, including neurotypical and students with different abilities and different presentations. But there definitely were students who, like, that loss is more pronounced and you needed to act sooner and kind of do something different in order to provide that student access. And that didn't happen. LA Unified made the policy decision that they just weren't going to make those decisions. They weren't going to expose their teachers and providers to in-person learning until recently, with very few and far between exception. And that was their decision. We're going to see if their assurances that they would address it on the tail end are actually going to be followed through on. I have some concerns, but it certainly was something that we were seeing, Lisa, happening in other districts and through other providers.
Very interesting. And Tammy, I would love to hear your story. I wonder if you can share, how did this year go? 4 kids with disabilities. That is, and you're still standing and you made time to be with us today. So tell us how you do it. You know what? You're on mute.
Thank you so much. I have 4, but the one who I'm concerned about all of them because I'm their advocate, but I'm concerned about Brock because he's on the spectrum. He's deaf in one ear and he's 15. So when the pandemic hit, COVID hit, I knew immediately that I had to fill in the gap. I knew it because Brock would get too far behind and he wouldn't be able to catch up. So that's what I did as a parent. I filled in the gap. I contacted the school immediately because I knew, I noticed that he wasn't able to, the visual learning was not connecting. I told them he'll sit there and he was going to days. So what I did, I contacted the school and I told them that I'm going to need some assistance because Brock is not connecting with visual learning. And I sat there with him and the team got together and we decided that we were going to give Brock more tutoring. The other kids, I watched them, but they were able to kind of hang in there. But Brock, I had to really fill in because if not, he was going to get behind. So what I did, when I contacted the team, and we also talked about his occupational therapy and also his speech therapy. I had to be on top of that because since he's deaf in one ear, he hears a lot of So I had to make sure that speech therapist and that occupational therapist was there for me. So what happened was that they called at least once. I think it was like once a week they would call me. They wouldn't even email, they would just text me and tell me they're here for Brock. The team was outstanding. They stepped in. LA Unified was, for me. Again, I jumped in there immediately as COVID hit, but he continued to have his occupational therapy. He continued to have his speech therapy. He received extra help with tutors from LA Unified School District. But I want you to know as a parent, I was in there. I mean, I was in there. And I wanted to really support him because as a parent, you already know that sometimes when you have kids who are disabled or they have an IEP or whether even educational issues, what you want to do, you don't want them to lag behind. So maybe I was one of the fortunate ones. But as of today, Brock and all the other 4 kids are doing really well. We're ready to go back to school. And Brock, he's ready to go back to school. He's really excited about it. But I can say there was a lot of challenges. But I just filled in the gap and I jumped in immediately because I did not want to wait on LA Unified School District. I did not want to wait on them because my child would fall behind. So as of today, Brock is doing well. Occupational therapy, speech therapy is going well. Bryant he's doing well with comprehension. He'll be graduating from school this year. He still has his speech therapy and occupational therapy. And then Brandon, who's 17, he still goes in and they still work with him. So it hasn't all been good. It hasn't all been bad. But I'm glad as a parent that I did recognize that COVID was here. I did recognize that the pandemic was here, and I knew we had a good team. We have an outstanding team, and it worked out for me, and we're ready to go back in fall. So my experience has been challenging, but I stayed in there with the children, and it worked. So I'm glad that LA Unified did step in for me, and they were supportive to me, and I'm happy about the outcome.
That sounds like you had a really great team, and I know
Yes.
all part to your building those relationships. We love celebrating schools that are doing a great job. Would you want to? Do you want to say what school? I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, and you won't believe this. My child is in a charter school, but I don't work, and I volunteer a lot. I'm a parent. I volunteer, and I have 4 children. I volunteer a lot, and the school is a Magnolia Science Academy. I live in the city of Carson. It's an academy school, which is also associated with LA Unified School District. But as a parent, I just think you really need to be close to your team. I have 4 children. I'm really close with my team. It's like, I feel like a family. You know, my team, we're like a family. And it's like they love my children. And I'm there for them, and they're there for me. So I think that as a parent, you just have to stay in there. Don't give up. You can't get discouraged, regardless of whatever the issue is, whatever the issue is, or what kind of whatever the issue may be. You cannot give up on your children. And not only that, I want to say this real quick. I'm an advocate for children, period. I'm an advocate for all my children, all children, and that's what I do. And I just think that we need to just work together. You have to keep in contact with your team. You can't wait around and wait for your team to contact you. If you're in need and your children have needs, you need to keep in contact with your team. And when you develop those positive relationships, they are these positive relationships, believe me, you will see the change in the children. So I'm excited about this year.
Thank you, Tammy. Alexis, did you have anything to add or to respond?
No, I'm glad to hear the story, because like I said, most of the time when people come to have meetings with me, it's because they haven't had that experience. So I know they're out there. I know from personal experience, that was my family until it wasn't. So I'm very glad to hear that that trend is happening. And I think what is important to take from Tammy's story is that there were members of that team who were willing to work creatively and figure out what the solution was. And that was what kind of the guidance from state and federal governments was. You need to meet with people and figure out what's going to happen in this unique circumstance. And I'm glad to hear that it happened in Tammy's case.
I am too. We need more stories like that, right? If everybody had this experience, we'd all go home. But Noelle, would you like to share your story with us as well?
Absolutely. Tammy, again, hats off to you. Excellent work, excellent advocacy. And then also just what a testament to the relationships that you've built in your kiddos' school. So my hat is off to you, ma'am. My story is kind of similar to Carla's in that my son, thankfully, we have a private insurance, and we're able to kind of just jump in and say, okay, what are we going to do to supplement what he is missing from school? However, we were really never able to figure out that social emotional piece that working with peers, being around peers, transitioning, all those things are still a challenge. I think immediately, we know we've kind of talked about this over and over, but the thing that was most shocking to me was just the absence of related services that happened right when the shutdown began. And for us, it pretty much continued through the whole school year. We were never offered in-person services. When I asked about them, they told me they are not available. And even as myself, I work in a school, and we were offering in-person services for students with IEPs since August 2020. And so it was really hard for me to kind of wrap my head around, why is this not available to my son? Another thing that was really challenging was just that my son has a one-to-one aide in his IEP. And when asked about it, they didn't have anything to say except the union is not allowing us to do that. We are not offering it under any circumstances. So we tried a couple things. One, we hired a one-to-one aide to come to our house and work with our kid all day. But then with the asynchronous versus synchronous learning, and then us supplementing our ABA therapists coming in and out of the house during that time, it was kind of hard to find like someone who wanted to come and work 2 hours in the morning and then an hour and a half later in the afternoon. So we kind of threw that to the wind. And thankfully, you know, my husband is a stay-at-home dad because he's the primary caretaker for our son. And that is like a beautiful blessing, and also challenging financially as well. So, but the wonderful thing is that he became our son's one-to-one aide. And, you know, I am still in awe of the hard work that he's done for all of these months, sticking through every single day, twice a day, 3 times a day, doing adaptive PE and whatnot. So there were a lot of challenges, and as you know from last week, and as we'll talk about later, they still continue because my son is not back in person.
Thanks for sharing your story, Noelle. It's been challenging to say the least, right? So, Alexis, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm not surprised. I mean, I think, Noelle, that's kind of a consistent story we've heard from a lot of families. And I applaud you and your husband for kind of figuring out how to make sure that you could minimize whatever learning loss was going to happen for your child. So kudos to you. I've seen parents all across the state kind of have to fill those holes. The thing that kind of stuck out again across the conversation was your comment about working for a school that was providing in-person services for those students that actually needed it. So, I mean, like I said at the start of this, we're all kind of thinking about, well, now we're coming back. We're starting to have conversations about like, what are we doing to make up for what happened in the past? And I think it's important to really stress now the conversations that didn't happen earlier as we were adjusting to remote learning, and look into where was my student when we got sent home in March of 2020? Where did the district expect him to be with whatever active IEPs were happening during the time that we were gone? If there were any IEPs that happened during the COVID-19 closures, which I know there were, but I also know that some students have come and said like, well, we didn't really have a meeting because it was Zoom and nobody did it. So it was just, we checked in and signed a paper, but we didn't talk about anything. But if you had those IEP meetings, you want to look at it and compare and say like, was this at the same rate of learning? Like how much did we discount or kind of make accommodations for expectation based on these circumstances? And as we get back to kind of a baseline program, really start thinking about, okay, we're back to normal learning procedures. Let's get back to kind of the rate of learning in terms of our planning for forward, but also let's consciously think about the gaps that were created and what is going to work for my child. What do I need to focus first to close that, right? Like it's not going to be the same for everybody. That's why when we heard talks earlier about like we're adding so many days to the school year and that's how we're going to make up for learning, like that seemed silly to me, because a couple extra school days is probably not going to close the gap, particularly for students in other areas of learning, right? Like if you needed speech and language therapy and got none over the last 12, 13 months, like 10 days of school is probably not the right target. So just making sure that families are going to be thinking about like areas of need and targeting compensatory or recruitment services to those specific needs is kind of the next step that we're starting to confront now that doors are opening and schools are letting kids back in.
I have a really specific question about that for you, Alexis. The district during a CAC meeting, a community advisory committee for LAUSD meeting, and I think during a LAUSD board meeting, the department or the Division of Special Education indicated that they don't really want to look at the lost hours of instruction and lost hours of therapy as something that you would need, or child would need compensatory time for, so much as it's called, they're going to call it recoupment. And the argument is well, compensatory time is for when you didn't offer services or that you did something wrong. But we did what we were supposed to do. We offered services virtually. And my question to you, and it's a pretty precise legal question, is providing physical therapy or occupational therapy, for example, which are therapies that are best done hands-on, right? Is offering them virtually, was that true delivery of services and true offering of free and appropriate public education? And what can parents argue? You know, what's within their rights?
So I think, again, that's going to come down. I mean, you guys have all had very unique stories, and the answer to this question is unfortunately going to be like a lot of that depends on what the goals were, what was offered, and what was actually implemented. Because I have seen the students come through where they had direct one-on-one, say, occupational therapy, where it was like hands-on, like in a clinic, like really intensive hour, however often. That was the nature of that service. And then when it went to remote, it was like, there's a YouTube video, go watch this. And like, mom, text me how it's going, which is, they're just not the same. So that's going to be kind of one end of the spectrum. I mean, I think I mentioned before, my family, I have teachers, I have principals, my sister's an occupational therapist. So like, I know like what her occupational therapy changed to, and I know that there were providers who actually stepped up to the plate and figured out how to do miraculous things through remote learning. And if you have that type of provider who took it seriously and has the type of relationship Tammy had, you can absolutely like have the conversations and say like, hey, how much did we lose? Like, I don't want hour for hour, because that's not even, if we're talking legal tests, like that's not even a legal test, but like really, hey, OT, who I trust and has really shown a commitment and works collaborative with me, like, what do you really think we're looking at here? And if you're having those honest conversations and getting genuine, honest answers, like by all means, that's going to be an easy solution down the road. Talk to your IEP team and say, you know, I'd like to ask for X hours, and that's what I'm hoping we can get to kind of put us to where we would have been but for COVID. But there are those providers who didn't, and I don't think it's in any way malicious, right? Like some providers just, I mean, they could have had the 4 children at home like Tammy did, and they just couldn't figure out how to do it, and everybody had a different reality while we were in this weird spot. But nevertheless, like what that student who had the OT provider who could do nothing more than like put up a worksheet and some instructions, and there was no kind of direct interaction, that's probably going to be a more intensive recoupment compensatory package down the road. And that's probably not going to be a situation where you can just get a realistic conversation going. You might be able to. I definitely encourage having those conversations at the forefront. But if it doesn't feel right, and moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas, like you're usually going to know if it's not feeling right. Like, I want to recommend that families are proactive and take steps to reach out for help with other parents or organizations like Learning Rights, because this is all going to move really quickly. Once we get back, there are going to be efforts to kind of like close out all of these recoupment claims or compensatory claims, and we want to make sure that we're ahead of the ball and our families are not getting left behind again, because we already know families dealing with disabilities kind of got, just because of the mad rush, they were already kind of pushed to the back in terms of having a seat at the table and being able to really advocate. So
thank you, Alexis. You know, we have a question from the comments on Facebook from Alcantar Mali. Maybe it's Mali Alcantar. She says, my son is in a special day class kindergarten in what the teacher calls a combo with kindergartners and first graders together in a class. And on top of this, at the IEP meeting, they decided that they don't know my student, so they can't keep the extended school year for this year from last. So they're basically saying, we don't know your kid because it's been virtual, is what I think this says. And because we don't know him, we don't think we should continue ESY this year. What can this parent do?
So that's a very kind of factually specific question. Like if what is genuinely being said is we don't know your student enough to kind of make a determination, like that's not an okay excuse for not making an offer. Like if a school district does not know or has questions about a student's presentation and need, state and federal law both say the district has the obligation to conduct assessments and understand the presentation and need and make an offer based on it. If what the answer is we haven't seen a need because of remote learning, that's a different question, different kind of case. But I would guess that it's hard to answer that, right? Because like we all know these students have been getting less than what they would have in classroom, and kind of the basic minimum of amount that's being received is going to be lower. So I can't imagine that there's not just kind of a presumption that there's been learning loss or going to be learning loss over the summer. But no, I definitely would encourage that family to kind of probe at what is the real message being sent in that denial. Is it we can't offer it because we don't know, because that's not allowed, or is it we don't see it, in which case the family should be identifying information that will counter that and explain what the student's needs are and what supports an offer of extended school year to keep momentum and ensure that there's not even more loss by the time we start, hopefully, fingers crossed for everybody, kind of everybody in person like we were before any of this hit for 21-22 school year.
Thank you. Really great advice. And I hope that Molly can benefit from that and help her kid get what he needs. So now we'll talk about, and you've already touched on it, going back to school, recoupment, remediation, compensatory time, whatever you want to call it, right? Here we go. What are we going to do to get our kids back on track? And I also want to know from the parents here with us today, how has school reopening been going? And Noelle, I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah, I got to share my story last week, so thanks for having me again, and I'm happy to be talking to you, Alexis. So we went back to school the first day, April 20th. My son went to class, enjoyed it so much, had like a beautiful day, came back just in great spirits, saying the word friends and his teacher's name, and it was awesome. Beautiful experience. But then later that day, I received an email stating that because my son wasn't able to follow the mask policy, he would be unable to come back to school. They did email me a waiver that my medical doctor could fill out for my son, and then they said that he could come back to campus, but we'd have to have a meeting. Later that afternoon, the principal called and said, well, actually, when you get that waiver signed, he can come back to campus, but I want to clarify, he can't go back in the classroom. He'll need to be in a separate location by himself, either outside or in a classroom adjacent. So it was pretty heartbreaking, and I went through a really rough week of trying to figure that out and what that meant for my son, who, well, I was just heartbroken. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Since that day, April 20th, we did hold an annual IEP meeting where I just realized no conversation about recoupment was brought up at all. But also the conversation continues of where are we and how can my son get services in person? And so but nothing has happened. We did submit the waiver signed by the medical doctor. I was asked about meeting dates this week. Today's Friday, and we haven't had a meeting. And so I'm just kind of waiting to hear back about what the next steps are. What I'm really clear about, though, is that my son will not be segregated from his peers on campus. I don't find that to be kind at all. And under no circumstances will my son be the only child zooming in to watch his peers play in the classroom and be interacting with his teacher that he loves. So right now, my son has been out of school since April 20th. What can I do, Alexis? I don't know if I'm supposed to ask you that.
No, not kind of giving direct legal advice, since the rules about that are a little specific, but I just want to first affirm your feelings that that's not right. And when you were saying that, like, as a parent, like I have the same kind of like heart stab, right? Like the idea of my kid going to school and because of something that he can't control, he's not going to get to have friends and not going to get to participate. Like that just, I can imagine everybody else is kind of aching at that story. Look, like we know why they're saying this is necessary. We can kind of put the blocks together about what the district's arguments are going to be. And we know kind of the research that they're going to use. We saw a lot of it in the learning rights lawsuit we did earlier in the fall. We know what they're going to say. That being said, we're having two parallel conversations and not really understanding how the two are supposed to come together. The district has all of its obligations to keep everybody safe. They have to follow health directives. They have to follow guidance from California Department of Health, the CDC recommendations. That's all something they have to juggle. That doesn't mean that they are not still bound by the laws that protect people with disabilities, like the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and also our students' IEPs and their rights under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. To make a blanket pronouncement about your student's programming without taking into account his needs and profile, I think is something that needs to be looked at really carefully in terms of the records and what specifically they've told you and put in writing. Because while I understand how they got there, I would have hoped that it went a little bit different, right? If you have a child who is having trouble following the mask mandate and that is interfering with his ability to be with his peers, is that a goal? Do you have a goal on mask wearing? Are you providing services to kind of enable the student to be able to do the behaviors and routines that are going to allow him access to his classroom? I haven't seen mask wearing goals, and if you're going to use mask wearing as kind of like a litmus test again in the classroom, like that needs to be something that you're targeting with programming goals services moving forward. And also, as we're talking about placement, like being segregated by yourself outside the window, like let's just put like the heartbreak aside for a minute. Like I assume your child is not the only one confronting this difficulty. So why is it like isolated as opposed to like, this is a classroom where we have similarly situated students who are working on issues related to their ability to wear a mask, and that's a behavioral thing, right? It's entirely different for students who have health situations, and like there are some students for whom they're just not going to be able to. This is like a behavioral thing, which we see a lot of times with sensory needs or students on the spectrum. That's something that can be worked on. I have seen, I'm going to go back to my family, but my brother with autism continues to have sensory needs, and he's an adult now. He's a grown man, which is hard for me as big sister to confront, but he's a grown man, and getting him to wear a mask was something that we had to actively work on, because we knew like he presents as a typical male, and walking into a grocery store or whatever, like people will not understand what's going on. So we did work with his program's behaviorist and figured out how to get it so that he could do it. Now he doesn't care. Like if you walk out and you don't grab the mask, he'll tell you like you forgot your mask. So it's something that can be done with appropriate intervention. There just, again, has to be thought given to it. And we have to work more on kind of connecting again to like the individual student and figuring out what should be done and what are the holes we need to fill here, and using our resources to actually do that.
Thank you, Alexis. I would just say that what I see across the system is that this paralysis, this overwhelm, and then there's no creative problem solving. You know, why doesn't Noel's son go into a class of similarly situated students? Why don't they come up with that? I'd also like to give Tammy and Carla a chance to talk about their return to school experience. And we're running low on time, so I'm going to ask you guys to try to be brief. Carla, you go first.
Okay, so Jordy, we've decided to keep him virtual or classified as virtual, which means he's still doing distance learning. That's entirely due to my current state of pregnancy. Otherwise, he'd be back on campus, but it's just a little too risky for us. What I was able to negotiate with our school was to continue speech and OT and one-on-one tutoring. So even though he's classified as virtual, he goes on campus in the afternoon and actually gets to do one-on-one speech, OT, and one-on-one tutoring with his teacher. So he's kind of getting, you know, as good as it's going to get for the current circumstance. And so virtual is still not working, but he's happy to be on campus 3 days a week doing his services and tutoring.
Thank you, Carla. And, you know, everyone's circumstance is different. Some of us want to send our kids back. Some of us don't. Some of us can't. Some of us do and can't want to, but can't. So it's been it's really interesting to hear all the different stories. Tammy, what about you?
Well, Brock is excited about returning to school. I mean, he is exciting, seeing his friends. He loves his team. I think he loves his team more than his friends. So this fall, he will be returning. His brother, Brandon, will be returning. And his oldest brother will be graduating from high school. So I'm looking forward to it. I also found out, I want to say this real briefly, is that, you know, when you develop these relationships with your team, it does something for your child. So Brock returning, although, you know, he's deaf and everything, and they really know it, but he loves them. And I just want to stress, he really loves them. And I think we just have to build these teams. We have to build our team and make sure, and sometimes people get on your team and they're not the right person for your team. They're not the right person. And because I make everybody somewhat, even myself, accountable. This team we have, everyone is accountable in my team. And if you're on the team and I feel like you're not a good fit, yes, I do. I confront it. Sometimes we have to have people on the team that it has to fit. So I'm excited about him going back. He's so excited. Oh, he's so excited. It gets me emotional. And Brad is excited. So I'm looking for a good year for 21-22, 2021-22 for Brock and Brandon.
Thank you, Tammy. And Tammy, do you have any concerns about how are you going to recuperate any lost time? Are you talking with your team about, okay, how are we going to get Brock back up to speed on this or that?
Well, like I said earlier, last year, I knew it was challenging going in. I knew this visual learning wouldn't work for him. I also knew it was COVID pandemic. Anything can happen. So again, I filled in the gap. So when he goes back to school, I'm not saying he's so far behind, because remember, I asked for extra help. The tutors were there, the occupational therapy, everybody was there. And it's somebody like making everybody accountable. So when he returns to school, I don't think he's that far behind if he was in the school year. But again, I'm on hands, I'm there, I'm listening, I volunteer my time, but I don't think Brock is so far behind that when he returns to school, that LA Unified School have to really push him. You know, I know where he is right now. His team know where he is. So I'm just looking for him going back, picking up where he needs to pick up. If he need additional tutoring or assistance in any area, see, I'm there. I mean, I try to make everybody accountable. That's what works for me. That's just what works for me. And by him returning back to school, and if he's up to part and everything, it's fine. If he isn't, we'll just work it out. It's no big deal. I don't make it a real big deal. I just work at it. You have to work at these teams. You have to work with your child. That's my experience. And it seemed to have worked over the years. And I'm glad about it.
Thank you, Tammy. I think I could use some coaching. I've had my own battles. A few kids with exceptional needs. I'll call you next time.
Yes.
We have a question from AC Espinosa. My nephew is 6 years old and LAUSD has Down syndrome. He's nonverbal, has behavior issues. They gave us a tablet and his instruction was videos on YouTube Kids. A packet of homework was sent. He did not have any of his therapists. He has regressed and is hitting again. His parents were told that since most of his classmates stayed online, he had to also. These are the stories I do not like to hear. Alexis, do you have any thoughts for this parent or this aunt or uncle, perhaps?
I mean, I guess I always have a hard time. I know we can't escape it as part of kind of a school setting, but the whole argument about because other people can do it, you have to too, feels weaponized there, right? And we don't see kind of the similar use of that. Everybody should do the same thing being used to kind of explain, giving additional or kind of closing gap between students with learning differences and kind of gaps in academic performance. We don't see the inverse happening there. If we're going to accept, like, because everybody else can read at a whatever level by the time they graduate, so we can expect everybody else to, then maybe we'll talk. But as long as it's just going to be used to make families feel bad about what their students can't do, I'm not on board for stuff like that. So that's fine that the other 10 students in that class can access on YouTube, and I'm glad for them. And that was just great circumstances for them. But because your nephew doesn't mean that his parents and family aren't doing everything they can to make that happen, or that it's bad that he's not able to access it. There are some students who, sitting in front of a laptop or an iPad or whatever device they're using, it's just not going to work. In the same way, like if everybody were on campus, there are some students for whom, like, this particular curriculum is not going to work, or this particular way of teaching math is not going to work, right? There are some students who just need something different. And the whole point of the IDEA is that when you have students who need something different, you figure out what do they need that's different, what's going to work, and then you offer the programming to get that student to make the same type of progress that they're capable of, right? So, I mean, that's kind of just me ranting, but it doesn't matter to me that everybody else can do it, right? Like, if everybody else can do it, that shows me that you are capable of getting students to a point where they're able to access better. So what are you going to do to enable this kid to access better? Let's not point fingers and say, like, you should be able to. The conversation should be, how do we make you able to? And it doesn't sound like that happened there.
Yeah, and some of you may have seen that on Wednesday, we did this conversation in Espanol on our Padres Unidos Facebook page, and your colleague and friend Heather Zaxon was our guest attorney, and she kept saying, individualized. It's all about individualized education. So whenever you hear something that's not quite right, think, is this individualizing education for my child? Because if it's not, then, and it's not working for him or her, then I'm going to have to push back on that. So, and she kept stressing that. And I think that's exactly, I mean, hey, she knows better than I do, right? So, Carla, I remember you and I were chatting the other day, and you had some really interesting comments about comp ed and recovery. Do you want to share that with the group?
Yeah, so I mean, for us, it's really important. I think that we've done a good job with our son's autism diagnosis, but academically, he hasn't learned anything this year academically, as far as like the milestone, the things that they're supposed to learn in kindergarten. So he's really far behind on that stuff, like the fundamentals of kindergarten. And so I've reached out to, the special ed department at LAUSD, and really all they're offering my son this summer is 4 weeks of ESY. Well, we get 4 weeks of ESY every summer. So how is that any different? And I said, what's the more robust plan for kids with special needs? Are you guys going to do something in addition? There may or may not be group tutoring for students with, IEPs. That's from Dr. Maribel Luna within LUSD. So they're looking into that to offer group tutoring during the summer, some sort of solution for recovery, which I don't think is adequate. And what I find really disappointing is that if most families want to really pursue comp ed, and really get everything back that they lost out on or weren't given, they're going to have to likely file for due process, because those things will not be given in an IEP meeting. And a lot of LUSD families can't afford or don't even know how to manage the due process. So that's really disappointing. And I'm not really happy with their response right now.
So I have a couple layers there. And this gets back to what, Lisa, you just pulled out from what Heather said, right? Like, a lot of the things we're seeing proposed about how we're going to do recoupment or recovery for whatever's happened during COVID are these kind of blanket, broad spectrum offers. And maybe that works for kind of a neurotypical, like, plain no issue student. Like, sure, you could offer that to the general population, but if that's not going to work for my kid, because they are entitled to individualized educational programs under the IDEA, you have to have more individualized conversation. And you're absolutely right, Carla. Like, these conversations are supposed to be happening at the IEP team level. That's what is supposed to be happening. That's what we are asking to happen. I mean, I don't think there is a special education attorney out there who would be upset if the problems went away and we had to find a different area of law to practice, right? Because of various policies and practices you see happening at school districts, and since we're all LA Unified, I know the exact policies and practices I think that have caused this setup. IEP teams have been disempowered from oftentimes making these conversations. I don't know if you guys have been in IEP meetings, I know I have, or everybody at the IEP team, I'm talking district employees, say, you know, this is what we think should happen. We can't offer it here. You have to go to due process. And that is a decision that's made at the district level. That's not families, that's not student attorneys trying to be litigious or whatever is said about families who hire attorneys. That is a district decision to try and manage offers in a way that they have more control over. So there are efforts right now to push IEP teams to have these discussions at the IEP team level. And that is a lot of what you're going to be hearing as districts start talking about how they're going to make these recoupment offers. What's also happening, and that I'm more concerned about, particularly given the families that the Learning Rights Law Center represents, is there are also efforts to acknowledging that due process can be scary and overwhelming. There are efforts to push an alternative path, which, I mean, we can debate all day long, alternative dispute resolutions, facilitated IEP meetings, all of the things that are kind of in the mix in terms of how are we going to discuss distributing these funds. And I don't think many attorneys, if we ignore kind of additional language about the role of attorneys is ignored, I don't think we're necessarily opposed to the idea that these conversations should be happening, not necessarily in due process for the very first time. What we are concerned about as we start having these conversations, and if you're not able to get kind of that recoupment conversation done in the IEPT meeting, one of the things that I'm concerned about is if it's going not through due process where families have access to assistance from people like me who kind of know the law and can protect rights that parents you sometimes know, but oftentimes they don't know, like the right that's behind the other right we're talking about, is that a lot of districts have set up alternative dispute resolution processes, but have done so in a way explicitly to exclude families from being able to get any sort of counsel. But put that aside, they're also having those ADR conversations in a context that also includes conversations about legal waivers. If there is an alternative dispute system, so you can avoid having to go to due process, where you talk about the gaps and you talk about the services and you are having a negotiation to figure out what should happen, that's fine. But the problem I have is when you have those conversations, you're also given a paper to sign to get those hours that you fought hard to negotiate for, that also says, I'm going to waive my rights. Because if you are ever asked to waive your rights, like that's a big deal. And a lot of times the extent to which that's a big deal is never explained to families. And if it is even explained, it's coming from the perspective of somebody who's taking the rights from you. And that's just kind of like a broader conceptual thing that I think we need to be much more careful about and have many more conversations about before we say, we're going to have a system whereby we are requiring families to waive rights in order to have access to this COVID recoupment money, services, etc. So that's my soapbox.
That is, it sounds like it could be its own program.
It can be.
And we have only 1 minute. I wanted to just jump back to Noelle really quickly because I saw your hand go up and I'm like, oh, I got to get back to her.
I guess I was just really wanting to respond to what we were talking about as far as like recruitment processes. And if the district is going to offer like a blanket offer to families, like we can do these group tutoring programs. I guess I'm just asking for us all to be asking the question, will it be available at every school in every community in every zip code? Because I know for sure that in South Los Angeles, I did not have the opportunity to take my son to any school for any service for the entire 14 months that we were off campus. So I just want to implore if anyone's listening from the district, like please make all of these things accessible to all families throughout the district.
Thank you, Noelle. The inequity is stark. I want to thank everyone here. Thank you all for lifting your voices. Thank you to everyone out there in Facebook land. We will get back to you about your comments and questions. Please check back in. We will be getting back to you. Reminder to like our page if you haven't already done so. We'd love to include you on our online community. And as surmountable as all these problems seem, remember, together we are stronger. Thank you, everyone. Keep on fighting. Keep on developing those relationships and building your teams. Onwards and upwards. Goodbye.
Thanks again, Alexis.
Thank you. It's good to
Nice
talk to
meeting
you.
you.
Good luck.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah, call if you need.